Well, good morning, everybody. This is John Michael. I wanted to talk about our two saints for today, Saints Pontian and Saint Hippolytus of Rome. Pontius was a pope that was briefly pope for just a couple of years before he was exiled and died a martyr's death. One of the fellows that was out in that same area, also having been exiled and martyred eventually, was Saint Hippolytus of Rome. Saint Hippolytus was one of the first anti-popes, if not the first, in the Western Church. He disagreed with the laxness of some of the popes, especially Pope Callistus, but even prior to that. And he set himself up as an anti-pope and created a schism within the church. He was quite popular. He wrote copiously, probably the most important writer of the 3rd century. And that's where he becomes interesting for the church at large. He also wrote some of the earliest descriptions of the ordination rite of priests and bishops. He also, and in that, it's the first time we hear the Virgin Mary mentioned in such a liturgy, in such a high liturgical context, from what I've been told in my reading, and might have been earlier. So there we have that, and he also wrote of the rite of baptism. Interestingly enough, when they came out and they received communion, they received under both kinds, of course, in the hand, as was the practice of the early church. And then they also received a cup of milk and honey to remind them of the sweetness of finding the new promised land in Jesus. Isn't that neat? So some things that we have that go all the way back in our ordination rites and in our liturgical settings go to Saint Hippolytus. He also wrote extensively against heresies and Bible commentaries, and that gained the notice of some of the emperor, and he was also arrested, exiled, and then eventually martyred. Both are esteemed by the church. Hippolytus, it seems that his schism is barely mentioned by anyone after that until much later. He was called a Novatian, which it's questionable whether he was a Novatian or not, but they indicate that there was some problem. They bring his body back, and he's buried with honors along the Via Tiburtina, so along the Tiber in Rome. And Pontius is buried in the cemetery of Pope Callistus, who was one of his predecessors. So they're both honored. Why are the works of Hippolytus not better known? Well, they kind of disappeared, partly probably because of his bad reputation in some ways. He writes very much in the style of Origen, is right up there with Origen in importance. He wrote extensively, but they were almost lost in the Western Church, and part of that is because he wrote in Greek, and the Western Church was more and more writing in and speaking Latin, which was the vernacular of the street people, so that people could understand them. So Hippolytus's works are kept alive mainly in the Eastern Church. So what's the lesson from all this? Well, be excited about your faith, as were both these men, and be willing to lay down your life. And also, lastly, and this is most important, be reconciled. Be reconciled. When it comes to the big stuff, they were both going to give their life for Christ. They focused on that, and there was a complete reconciliation between Hippolytus and the Roman Church, and communion was reestablished. That's a great lesson. We can all go through that lesson. I love you. St. Pontius and Hippolytus, pray for us, and remember, all things are possible with God.